Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. I'm Sarah Jack.
And I'm Josh Hutchinson. When most people think about witch trials in America, they think of Salem in 1692. But witch hunts didn't end there.
Today, we're traveling back to Vermont to revisit an extraordinary woman whose story we were first introduced to 2 years ago by Jamie Franklin, curator at the Bennington Museum, who rejoins us today with an update.
Also joining us today is Joyce Held of the Pownal Historical Society, who has spent years researching the woman known only as Widow Krieger, uncovering her real name and life story.
Joyce and Jamie are bringing more light to the story by connecting this woman's witch trial to the broader political tensions of post-Revolutionary War America.
This is the story of Margaret Krieger's trial by water in midwinter, now updated with a surprise twist.
We will now open with the delightful conversation we had with Joyce Held, and then you'll hear Jamie Franklin reveal a shocking surprise that we didn't know was coming until the recording. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. We are so delighted to get to talk to you about a Vermont accused witch today. Please introduce yourself and tell us why it's so important for you to preserve historical stories.
My name is Joyce Held. I'm on the board of the Pownal Vermont Historical Society. And of course, my passion is to capture, preserve, and share the history of not only our town, but history in itself for future generations.
Thank you so much. How did you first get interested in this Vermont witch trial?
Years ago, I really tried to remember when it became the little niche in my brain that kept bugging me. But I read somewhere along the line a clip from, it was T.E. Brownell, that was in I think it was the 1868 or something like that, Vermont Gazetteer, about the witch trial and the Widow Krieger. And it was a very short little article that Mr. Brownell wrote. And it kind of intrigued me. But that's all it was Widow Krieger. It didn't know her name, didn't know anything about her, just Widow Krieger. And so off and on over many, many years, she would surface back and I'd do a little more research and whatever. And then all of a sudden, it wasn't just, let's find out about her. It was more like, I know her. I want to know more about her. That's when I started to really get involved.
So she is a real person, and her story was just really calling out to you. Would you like to tell us about her and what you found?
What intrigued me was that it was stated that Widow Krieger was accused of being a witch after her husband had died in 1785. Of course, I didn't know this. This is the things I found afterwards. It didn't give a date. But after her husband had died, she had been accused of being a witch. Her accusers called her an extraordinary woman. And she was brought before the safety committee. And the safety committee decided that there were two tests that they could put her to find out if she truly was a witch. The first one they could use would be where they would have her climb a tree. And she would climb a tree and they would cut it down. If she survived, she was a witch because the devil saved her. If she didn't survive, she wasn't a witch, but she'd be dead. So that didn't sound too appealing, I don't think, to anybody. The second one was the water test, and that's the one that they decided that they would do because they're right there along the Hoosick River here in Pownal. So they cut a hole in the ice, and they dropped the widow in, and the idea was if she sank, she wasn't a witch. If she floated, then that meant the powers of Inferno were holding her up. Well, fortunately for Widow Krieger, she sank like a rock. And they were able to pull her out and save her. So she was acquitted. So that's what started the whole adventure, my adventure of, I need to know more. Yeah.
And these pins that we're wearing is an illustration of that second test?
Yes, indeed. Yes, when she was dropped into the river and pulled back up. Yeah.
And this is your art?
No, it's a friend's artwork. Yeah.
A friend's artwork?
Yeah. But to me, it shows, what really happened. Yeah. So then I was fascinated with that. So first question was, who was she? The only thing I could resonate to was the fact that we have a outcrop of rocks in North Pownal, and we all call them Krieger rocks.
Oh.
And it's like anything else. So you're just raised with it or whatever. And so it's just Krieger rocks. And question, why is it Krieger rocks?
Wow.
And so then I thought, so there we are. And it's North Pownal. And so I started going back through there and was able to find Johann Krieger, who came along the Hudson, and the Dutch worked along through the Hudson, and they actually kind of got mixed up once or twice. But anyway, they wound up along the Hoosick River, because the Hoosick River eventually does go into the Hudson. And he and a group of others had come to the frontier land of what would become Pownal, because there was nothing here, absolutely nothing here. And it was fertile land. The Native Americans had been here, and they would hunt and fish and everything here. So it was fertile land. So they cleared land. Johann was an experienced mill builder. And so he built a mill along the river, built a house. And so I thought, so who is this man? So his name is Krieger. Just doing research, digging here, digging there, I came across a marriage certificate from the Albany Reformed Church for 1741 that Johann married Margaret Schumacher from Williamstown, Massachusetts. So now I had Widow Krieger's first name, Margaret Schumacher. And so then that's when she had a name, and I started learning about her. She was 16 when they married. He was 14 years her senior. And she moved to the frontier land of Pownal, not Pownal, but where it was the east side of the Rensselaer Manor, is what it was called. And then, of course, it got involved with the New Hampshire grants and all that. But anyway, it eventually became Pownal, and Pownal eventually became part of the state of Vermont. But this was all before that. So that's how I found her name. And then they had 3 children. They had 3 sons. And it was fascinating to read the fact that 3 sons, obviously, they learned from their father building mills. And the town of Williamstown had actually, when these young men became like 20 years old or so, they invited them to Williamstown to build mills for them, for the town of Williamstown. And they were given land in Williamstown. And they proceeded to build some mills down there, which was called Krieger Mills, down in the town of Williamstown, Mass. So it was kind of unique because Marguerite was from Williamstown. Johann had the shop in mill in, I'm going to say Vermont, but it wasn't Vermont, but in Pownal. And it was only like an 8-mile difference. We're very close to the border. So they actually had citizenship, I think, dual citizenship, because it was very easy to own property in Williamstown, Mass, own property over the border, what would become Vermont. So that's how they got to be dual residents, I guess I would call them. Yeah. I guess the first thing that happened was their middle son, Peter, died at a very early age. And I'm still working on what he died from. I have no clue. But it was 27 years old, never was married. And I don't think it was a sickness because he was hardy in building mills. Tend to think maybe it was an accident at the mill, but I can't say it till I find out. So
Yeah.
that's one of those question marks in the side. And then when you're writing something down, question mark. What he did, the youngest son, William, he went off to the Battle of Bennington and was killed. So in a short period of time, they lost the 2 sons. And they only had John George. By that time, they were using the English names, Johann Uri, but John George, but their son, John George. So that's what was left before Johann Sr. there passed away.
Is there anything you want to tell us about the battle or that time period?
I look at Marguerite and I admire her. I truly, truly admire her. At the age of 16, she left her family home, came to a place where, there were Native Americans here. We have a road called Indian Massacre Road. There were Indian upheaval type things going on, raids and burnings and all that thing. And here she is, before she's 21 years old, or just about 21 years old. She's a wife. She's a mother of 3 boys. They're running a mill. They're farming because they raise the grain to mill. I just admire her. And I keep saying to people, yeah, they were right. She was an extraordinary woman. I mean, she was strong. She was one strong, extraordinary woman, and she was resilient. And I just totally admire her. And she was all about family. And I can tell you that because when William died, of course, she was mourning his death. I call him her sweet William. When William died, she went back to Williamstown because he had babies. His children were just tiny. And so she went and moved in with Margaret, what her daughter-in-law thing was, and moved in with Margaret to help with the children. So she was back and forth, helping her husband at the mill in Williamstown, supporting the family. And then, of course, Johann, obviously with the 14 years difference, he got elderly before she did. And then she had a sick husband. And so she just took care of everybody. She was just amazing. And I really, really took her on as a friend. And I just wanted to tell her story. I just thought, it's time for you to shine, Marguerite. It's time for you to shine. And shame on the people who disrupt her life by saying that she was a witch. And it was pure greed. It was pure greed. I mean, the husband was gone. Back when, in 1760, when the New Hampshire grants were happening, the English came and they looked upon the Dutch as squatters. They were landowners. They were squatters. Well, I beg to differ. They came and they took that land and they made it useful. And I just recently found a petition that Johann sent to Governor Wentworth, stating the fact that he and his neighbors had for over 20 years been working this land, raising the wheat or whatever they were, the corn, whatever they were grinding. And he asked if they could give them their land. And lo and behold, the proprietors did recognize the fact that Johann improved the land, and they did allow him to keep his land. So then when he dies in 1785, what are they going to do now? This man owned that mill. He owned that land. And there's just this one lady that is the owner. And the English, of course, were quite familiar with the witch accusations. And because you figure that Marguerite spoke a different language, her customs, her mannerisms, or whatever you want to call them, were different than the English. And so, because she was different, it was different. And she did land. They wanted it. Boy, they wanted it.
And it doesn't sound like they waited long.
Oh, no. They were right.
Passed and she was in trouble.
Exactly. Yeah, they wanted it done. And after she was acquitted, I think she was done with this whole area. And she went back to Williamstown, and that's where she lived out her rest of her years. She died in 1790, and she lived with William's children, her grandchildren. And she had sheep, and I read her will, and she had a granddaughter, Margaret, all these Margarets, and she divided the sheep amongst the 3 children of William. And she left Margaret her aprons. It's just beautiful. It's something that grandmother would do. Here's my favorite apron, or this is my favorite bedspread or quilt or whatever it may be. The Bibles, Dutch Bibles, just all the different things that we do today. We give to our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren to carry on that tradition. Yeah, family meant a lot to her. And just a great woman. I could just go on and on and on. But anyway, she was a wonderful woman.
Yeah, on family, is much known about what became of her grandchildren? Has anybody come forward to you and said, hey, we're descendants?
Yes. Like I said, after she had after the trial and everything, Krieger name does not show up in Vermont history ever again as anyone living here by that name. All we have left is Krieger Rocks, which is wonderful. We got that. And so now we've got at least something, a monument to that name. The families knew each other. When I was talking about that petition that Johann sent, one of the names he had on that petition was a family name that the offsprings of the Krieger family in Williamstown married into. Yeah, so there's names and there's people, and yes, and I have talked to people that says, oh, I never knew that. I just knew that, didn't know about this Vermont part of the history. So yeah, there's some people out there that are part of the history. And it's great to talk with them. One lady in particular wants to stay anonymous, but she's done a lot of research, and her and I have been chatting back and forth, and it's just really nice to put the story together. It's just like working with somebody's family tree, and you go, oh, you call up the cousin and say, hey, I found out what. So
yeah, in that sense, it's still living history.
It is. It is.
Her legacy lives on.
And I think that what she went through and all of that, I think you look at today and you realize that some things have changed, some things have not changed. History does repeat itself. And then on the other hand, we should learn from history. We should learn from history.
So wonderful. Can you tell us about how you and your community are commemorating her?
I was doing all this work and what have you in 2023. I was working with Jamie Franklin from the Bennington Museum, another project. And so we were working on this art project. And during the course of back and forth of something, really how we got onto it, I'm not sure. But I mentioned Widow Krieger, and Jamie was wanting to know more. And so we told the story. And so he was saying, oh, they're putting in a marker up in Manchester for I don't know if you heard about the Manchester Vermont vampire. They had a marker they put up. It's the Pomeroy Foundation and Vermont Folklore. And I looked at him and I said, Marguerite needs a marker. Widow Krieger needs a marker. So then that's when we both decided this is exactly what we want to do. And we worked together and we dedicated it September of 2023 along at the Stowbridge Park in North Pownal on G Road along the Hoosick River, right below Krieger Rock. And it's just fitting. It's just beautiful. And last year we had our second annual Witches Walk, and now we're planning our third annual Witches Walk this September 13th. So, and what we do is it's in remembrance of Marguerite, but it's also celebrating women. It's celebrating women because my theory is all women are extraordinary in their own way. We're unique. Each one of us is special. And I just want to get that message across. We're unique in our own special way. And our strength. And no offense to the gentlemen. I mean, we don't work out with the iron, so anyway, but our strength and our resilience, we hold the families together and keep the fires burning when the husbands or the fathers are off to war or whatever.
Yeah. And the walk, it's people from the community coming together. And what's the path? You go from like town to the river, or how does that work?
It's amazing where the people come from all states. We have people from Salem that come from all over, and that's wonderful. And we have all ages, babies and strollers, and we have all genders. And it's just a real community feeling, and miles galore, and some tears. And what we do is there's a lovely bridge that goes across from depending which side you're on, but it goes east and west over the Hoosick River. And so we go onto the west side and we all gather there and we walk across the bridge, play music, dancing, whatever we want to do. It's all about celebrating and remembering. And then we go to the park. And we have refreshments and we have talks. We tell the stories. It's a community thing. It really is. And we had wonderful dancers there, a group of ladies dancers there last year, and they're coming back this year, which really gets everybody involved and everybody wants to dance. And yes, it's just everybody feels like they're being seen. So we're like, you're here. I see you and we love you. That was almost like a sisterhood.
Yeah. Yeah. She took the brunt of something for other women, and you're able to celebrate.
Yes. And you know what? During the whole thing, researching her, and I've done genealogy for so many years, and we've been all over the world doing things with different family lines. And I'll share something, the fact that I do talk to the people that I'm researching. And I don't want to be spiritual or whatever, but I do talk to them and I'll ask them things. sometimes I'll go to a cemetery and I can't find them. And I'll say, where are you? And then I'll say, okay, you don't want to be found today. I understand. And then I maybe go back a couple of days later, like, where are you? And then I go right there. Okay. So, and then I laugh and say, are you playing tricks on me? The whole thing. But I was thinking with Marguerite, how she must have felt when all this was happening. She had 3 sons, 2 were gone. She was trying to be the stand-up, strong person for her boys' families. She had to be, their father died. So she had to be the stand-up mother, don't break down, be strong for the kids. And then this happened. It's just so insulting. And I kept thinking, what would I do if I was there? What would I have done? And then the thought was like, would I be strong enough to say, no, she's not a witch? And put myself out there. Maybe there would be 2 dunkings that day. But when I found her stone, and I was able to, because it was a long time finding where she was buried. But when I found her stone and I walked over to it, I hugged it and I cried. And I told her I was so sorry for what she went through. And it was very, very emotional. I could feel that she felt it, that somebody understood.
That's really beautiful. Was extraordinary, and it's special that her burial is known and she can be remembered there by family and community. But then you have the marker and the rocks. It's really together. That's just really wonderful because it's so rare to have so much, even though it's not a lot for what she went through. I'm really glad those pieces of the story kept speaking to you. Yeah.
No, it definitely, I enjoyed, and I'm sure that I'll be meeting her up in heaven before I get the whole story together. Because every day when I pick up something, I go, oh, yeah, I still haven't found out where Peter, how he died. And I go off and I'm looking where Peter died. And that's how I found the petition. Because you go down this street and you think you're going in the right path, but then you take a turn. And the next thing you know, you're off with another member of the family. If you ever done research, and I'm sure you have, it gets to be a huge, gigantic puzzle. And you think you're looking for this piece, but you realize that you're going to find this piece before this piece will fit in there.
Yeah. I'm just so excited that you found that petition. Those types of documents really fill stories in. You were able to see his efforts when he was fighting for his property. He had his wife in mind.
Sure.
He knew he was older than her and his descendants. And then you were able to see how families married and came together, names that were, so that I just love these petitions. I'm so glad you found it.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Joyce. This has been a real pleasure. It's such a compelling, powerful story. Reminds me in some ways of other witch trials, but it's so unique in many of the details and the timing of it. And I'm just grateful that you've done this research into it. So thank you for joining us today. When will the Witches Walk be held this year?
It'll be held Saturday, September 13th at the Strobridge Recreation Park. And it's on Dean Road in North Pownal, Vermont. And we start about noon and it goes on all afternoon. So all is welcome and come out and enjoy. So, and thank you for showing such a great response and enthusiasm to the story, because getting the story out and having people like you and Sarah working on getting the word out of what happens and just reminding us all where we come from.
And I want to point out real quick that your Historical Society's social media is so wonderful. You are active on Facebook, and I really look forward to those posts. So listeners can find you guys on Facebook.
Yes, Pownal Historical Society. And we are working on our website, which would be www.pownal.org. So it's real quick and easy. And we are revamping that whole website. So it'll have more stuff and be able to be updated a lot easier. It's a lot of work. But just getting the word out and that for people who are interested. But we're here and we're passing the word along, and we're passing along the good vibes and the happiness and cheer to everyone.
Welcome back to the podcast, Jamie Franklin. Last time we chatted, this podcast was still audio only, and we called it Thou Shalt Not Suffer, the Witch Trial Podcast. A lot has changed but we are still very much the same. And we're so happy to have this opportunity to add you to our fresh discussion of the widow Margaret Krieger, the accused witch of Vermont. Please introduce yourself and tell us about your work at the Bennington Museum.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be back. Again, my name is Jamie Franklin, and I guess my official title at the Bennington Museum is Director of Collections and Exhibitions. The simple title is Curator. So basically, I'm the curator at the museum. I'm in charge of developing our collections, researching our collections, and then presenting them to the public, whether that be in exhibitions, publications, or podcasts like this. So I get to play with all the old stuff, basically, is what I do at the museum.
And before we begin our discussion of Widow Krieger, or I should say, before we resume our discussion of Widow Krieger, I'd love to know about what's happening at the museum right now. Could you tell us about the current exhibit, Green Mountain Magic, Uncanny Realism in Vermont?
Yeah, it's largely a visual art exhibition, and it's a project that I've kind of had in the back of my head for about 15 years. It has its origins in an exhibition that was at the Museum of Modern Art back in 1943. And when I started working here at the museum, actually, I'm celebrating my 20th anniversary here coming up in a couple of weeks. So I've been here a while. So one of the collections that we're most known for is having the largest public collection of the work of Anna Mary Robertson Moses, or Grandma Moses. And so she was probably one of the best known self-taught artists in America, if not in the world, in the mid-20th century. And a lot of my research as a curator, particularly of Grandma Moses's work, has been into the kind of intersection of the work of self-taught artists and modernism in America. And as I was doing my early research on Grandma Moses, I came across the fact that a number of exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in the late 30s and early 40s featured not only Moses, but other self-taught artists, including Patsy Santo, who was an artist who lived here in Bennington. Santo, along with about 5 other artists, were in an exhibition at MoMA in 1943 called Realism and Magic Realism. And it kind of clicked my interest in why were all of these artists from Vermont in this exhibition. And so the exhibition features those 6 artists, Patsy Santo, Ivan Albright, John Atherton, Paul Cadmus, and Jared French, and Vanessa Helder, along with another group, another about 6 or 7 artists who were working in the realm of magic realism, which, to give a real quick, I won't say definition because I don't know that there is a definition, but it's kind of a parallel with surrealism. But instead of dwelling on like dream worlds and the unconscious, it focuses on real world imagery, often painted very, very crisply and so intensely that it almost feels like you're in a dream, but it's not of a dream, it's of the real world. That's kind of my quick and dirty description of it. And so the exhibition really explores these artists who are working in Vermont in the mid-20th century. But I also folded in the work of Shirley Jackson, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more here in the course of the podcast.
That sounds really wonderful. The website does give a peek into the exhibition, but now, hearing you talk about it too, I'm like ready to jump on the plane and fly across the country.
It's been a fun one to see come together. Like I said, sometimes these exhibitions live in our heads as curators for a long time, and to be able to see them. And it's some of my favorite work, really, to be honest. One of my favorite paintings of all time is in the exhibition.
That's so wonderful. Can you remind us about Shirley Jackson and her contribution to the legacy of the Salem witch trials in literature, and about her collection at your museum?
Yeah, so I've known Shirley's children, particularly Lauren Simon, her oldest son, for a number of years. And in 2021, so going on 4 plus years ago, he approached me about the possibility of donating a collection of materials, archival materials, manuscripts, first edition copies of her books, her dining room table, which she used to write some of her final novels on, a haunted music box, a bunch of materials that kind of help flesh out Jackson's career as a writer, but also her life in North Bennington, where she lived and worked for most of her career. And so that collection ended up coming to us in 2023. One of the books that isn't as well known was a book that she wrote and published in 1956. The name always escapes me. It's, I think, The Witchcraft of Salem Village. We received a copy of that as part of the collection, and it was published in 1956 as a children's book for children ages 8 to 12. And just thinking about kind of the kind of cultural zeitgeist of the mid-20th century, of course, this was during the Cold War, in the decade or so just after World War II. And basically, Jackson, who had widespread interest in witchcraft, the occult, mythology, folklore, wrote this book. And it was basically a way of talking about the dangers of false accusations, not having your due justice in a court of law, and just false accusations, basically, and how that kind of connected the 17th century witch trials with the mid-20th century kind of Red Scare, McCarthyism that was happening in the mid-20th century. And I think Jackson was very much aware of those kind of historic ties.
Another great exhibit that your museum has had in 2023, you did one called Haunted Vermont, and that prominently featured Margaret Krieger's story. Can you tell us about why that exhibit was important and share how you became involved in highlighting the story of Widow Krieger?
Haunted Vermont was here at the museum back in the late summer, fall of 2023. And it was basically the acquisition of the Shirley Jackson archive that I mentioned was really one of the major impetuses behind that exhibition. Like, as I said, I had been working with Lawrence, her eldest son, for a couple of years in bringing it to the museum. But there were a number of other stories that were floating around in my mind, and how I work as a curator is to try and think of how some of these, I can bring these stories together and become some sort of kind of cohesive narrative, or at least a compelling way that kind of tells how kind of history happens over time and through the centuries. And so Haunted Vermont brought together stories like the trial of Margaret Krieger, Widow Krieger, in the 18th century. It also featured the demon vampire of Manchester, Rachel Burton. It talked about spiritualism in the 19th century, talked about the Bennington Triangle, which was a lore about an area here in the Bennington area in which at least 5+ people disappeared in the mid-20th century. And then Shirley Jackson, whose story kind of weaves through many of those topics, including witchcraft, as we just mentioned, the Bennington Triangle. One of the missing persons was Paula Weldon, who was a student at Bennington College, where her husband, Stanley Hyman, taught, and factored into a number of her short stories, novels, in some ways more direct and some less direct.
And was Margaret Krieger's story the newest piece, like the newest piece of history that was most recently uncovered, I should say?
It's one of those where there was little bits and pieces of it out there, and I was familiar with it. And so while I was working on the exhibition Haunted Vermont, exhibitions usually take at least a year, sometimes upwards of 5. Or in the case of magic realism, they live in the back of a curator's head for 15+ years. In the year or two leading up to Haunted Vermont, when I knew it was happening, I basically started chasing some of the stories that I thought were most interesting and compelling to see how I might be able to incorporate them into an exhibition. And so I reached out to the folks at the Pownal Historical Society, and most notably Joyce Held. And it turns out that Joyce had been working on the Krieger witch trial and Widow Krieger and trying to figure out more about it and more about her and her life story. And so it was kind of just serendipity where there was a little bit of knowledge out there, and Joyce had a whole lot more to give. And I think the kind of impetus of the exhibition happening allowed her to dive in a little bit more. And it just came together. And it was, like I said, one of the stories that we really highlighted in the exhibition itself, because Joyce had been able to uncover so much and give Widow Krieger, as she was known in the historic record, a name and a story that we could all relate to.
Can you tell us how the historical marker came about?
Yeah, so that was also basically just kind of part of the process of organizing the exhibition. As I mentioned earlier, one of the other stories that we told in the exhibition was of the demon vampire of Manchester, or Rachel Burton. And in 2022, the year before the exhibition here in Bennington, Sean Harrington, who's the curator of the Manchester Historical Society, just north of us here in Bennington, ended up working with the Vermont Folklife Center and the Pomeroy Foundation, which is a foundation out of New York City who provides grants to institutions and individuals to tell stories about local history, and particularly about folklore and local historical folk tales. And I reached out to Sean up in Manchester, and he helped connect me with the folks at the Folklife Center in Vermont up in Middlebury and the folks at the Pomeroy Foundation. And I worked with Joyce and the Pownal Historical Society to get this marker erected. It was actually installed in September of 2023 while Haunted Vermont was on the walls here at the museum. So it all came together simultaneously in the process of working on the exhibition with Joyce and the folks up in Manchester, up in Middlebury. And so it just came together at the right time.
When we get to learn about these stories that have been hidden and they bubble up. It really is wonderful. And then to hear, the coordination and the collaboration that came out of the research and the effort to tell her story, it's really lovely. And is there anything else that you would like to share about that history or this ongoing story?
The story of Widow Krieger was kind of out there as I was doing my research, but there wasn't a whole lot. And we still don't have a lot of primary documentation of the Krieger witch trial. We know who Widow Krieger is, Margaret Krieger. We know a lot more about her life than we knew previously. And there are lots of other wonderful stories, which I'll share here shortly. But I think what's really interesting is why, as a curator, I think it's important to highlight these stories is because I like to say that this is the story of the Krieger witch trial is kind of the story that never dies. I can't tell you how many podcasts or interviews, radio interviews, newspaper interviews I've done since we did that exhibition and we erected the marker. Joyce and the folks down at the Pownal Historical Society are in the process of organizing the 3rd annual Witches Walk, which is an annual event, community event that they organize down there in Pownal to celebrate and commemorate Widow Krieger and other extraordinary women. Extraordinary women is a quote from T.E. Brownell's original telling of the witch trial, which was published in the 1860s. But in the process of working on the exhibition, and then in the years since, kind of continuing to dig in deeper, we've just continued to find interesting stories. While I was working on the exhibition, because Joyce had already done so much research into the life of Margaret Krieger, what I wanted to do as the curator was kind of try and help maybe a bigger kind of contextual picture of one of the things that really surprised me was the fact that there were still witch trials happening in New England as late as the 1780s, the decade after the American Revolution. That really surprised me. And one of the things that I did was try and find references, local historical references to witches and witchcraft during that period. And one of the stories that I dug up was published in the Bennington Banner. It was published anonymously. We don't know the person that was telling the story, but he talked about when he was a young boy that he'd hear 3 witch stories in a month. Now he only heard 1 witch story in a month, but also how through the process of the Enlightenment, stories of people waking up on the back of a broom and flying through the sky at night used to be attributed to witchcraft. And by the early 19th century, when he was publishing the story, it was probably put off to indigestion or, mania of the mind. So they were starting to understand that things like witchcraft may not be grounded in the same sort of reality that they thought about it in earlier times. Witchcraft really was a thing that people would have been commonly familiar with here in southwestern Vermont in the late 18th and early 19th century. And that really surprised me. We tend to think of it as something that happened in the 17th century, but it was still happening more than 100 years later.
Definitely. Yeah, it surprises people that Salem wasn't the end of all the witch trial activity and the naming people as witches, because we certainly 18th, 19th, even 20th century see slander suits, other kinds of people throwing the name around still at each other and that kind of thing.
Yet one of the most recent additions to my understanding of the Krieger witch trial, as I said, we've had very little primary documentation or evidence to go on. Joyce recently uncovered a document that kind of shows her husband, Uri Krieger's kind of petition to Benning Wentworth about getting land and being granted that land. And so we've had an ongoing working theory that she was likely accused of witchcraft by her neighbors because her husband had died. She was a woman. Owning land by a woman in the 18th century was basically against the law. And they had been granted this land as Dutch squatters. They were on the New York side of things, whereas most of their neighbors were English settlers who had been granted their land through the New Hampshire land grants and Benning Wentworth. Because he had built a mill, because he had improved the land, he was given that land. It's likely that their neighbors were jealous. And when he passed away, that would have been why they would have accused her of witchcraft, was so that they could take that land from her. But just in the last couple of weeks, one of Widow Krieger's descendants reached out to Joyce and I about kind of family lore, the fact that there was lore of the witch's curse in their family, but he didn't know the story of Widow Krieger. He was able to put the pieces of his family lore together and connect it with a real ancestor who was actually accused of witchcraft. But as that correspondence played out, he was also interested in Widow Krieger's son, William Krieger, who was said to have died in the Battle of Bennington, a Revolutionary War battle that was fought, 248 years ago on Saturday. This last Saturday was the 248th anniversary of the Battle of Bennington on August 16th, 1777. And in fact, William Krieger had fought in the Battle of Bennington, but interestingly, he didn't fight on the side of the Patriots. He was a Loyalist. And so most of New Yorkers, or a lot of Yorkers, were Loyalists. They were loyal to King George III of England. And so the fact that the Kriegers were Loyalists is probably another factor as to why they might have wanted, this is just in the decade after the Revolution. The Revolution really didn't come to a completion until 1783. Uri Krieger passed away in 1785. There was probably still lots of tension in Pownal between the English settlers, who were largely patriots, and the Krieger family, who were Loyalists. And so I haven't even had an opportunity to talk about this theory with Joyce, but we have a letter, a firsthand account of the Battle of Bennington that was written 2 days after it by a man named Joseph Rudd, who lived in West Bennington. And in it, he talks about fighting against his neighbors and talks about taking 4 of his neighbors prisoner in the Battle of Bennington. And it turns out they were literally, Joseph Rudd lived in West Bennington, and next to him lived the Snyder family and the Hallenbeck families. And the Snyders and the Hallenbecks were Loyalists, and they were taken prisoner by their neighbor at the Battle of Bennington. So these sorts of historical contexts, that's why having a story like this and being able to make it public and being able to think about it and talk about it on a regular basis, it helps us flesh out the story more by more. The history is all there, but it takes a little bit of time for it all to fall into place and help us put the pieces of the puzzle together so we understand how it all fits together as a larger story.
Thank you. That's so great. That was so great, Jamie.
Yeah, that really changes how we think about the story, even because you had kind of the outsider narrative there to begin with them being German and they're not English. They're, like you said, the New York claim, not the New Hampshire claim. And now they're Loyalists. So that makes sense why the Committee of Safety or the Council of Safety would have been interested in the widow after this, because maybe she is also a Loyalist.
Mm-hmm. Assuming if her son was a Loyalist, it's very likely that Widow Krieger would have been a Loyalist too. I'm no expert in this, but I do know that people who were Loyalists tended to be persecuted in the years after the Revolution. Land was taken from them, property was taken from them. They may not have been able to take away their land simply based off of the fact that they were Loyalists. Maybe they had rescinded, maybe the revolution was over, those things had been settled. But I think that it certainly probably played a part in the story that we haven't previously realized, because it hadn't dawned on us. That would have been an issue that would have been very much top of mind at that exact moment when she was accused.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think it's significant. And I appreciate how your expertise in your work with building exhibits to flesh out stories and build context, it really helps us understand just stories. So not just art and artifacts, but what you do and how you help us, the public, look at things is so important. And I appreciate that. When you say this was top of mind in the community, that is like really significant. I'm hearing other histories around witch trials where what is top of mind is now really being considered more, where maybe they were just looking at what documents they had about court hearings or slander, but looking at that broader picture as we can fill in the details of what the community was experiencing and what were they committed to at the time. It's so important. So thanks for reminding us about that today.
Yeah, I think it's important and this kind of connects to the present and why I think Widow Krieger's story is so important, Margaret Krieger's story is so important, and why thinking about a witchcraft trial that happened 240 years ago is still relevant to us today, is that if we just say, oh, she was accused of witchcraft, well, we don't believe in witches anymore, so that's not pertinent to us. But if we start to understand the political and cultural contexts in which these were happening, these are essentially assuming that the issue of loyalist versus patriot did play a role in this. And I think there's a very good chance that it did. Then you start to realize that it's essentially basically political factions who disagree with one another on political grounds, using their kind of political stance as a means to take land away from somebody. And that's the sort of thing that's still very real in our world today in the 21st century, using our political perspectives, regardless of which side of the aisle we're on, to persecute and slander people in our communities. So I think those larger contexts really help us understand how the past connects to the present in really direct and important ways.
They definitely do. And, with America 250 happening, the 250th, you said the Bennington just celebrated or commemorated, I should say, the 240th anniversary of the battle at Bennington. So the 250th is coming up. And now you've got this extra information about Widow Krieger. And it just seems so timely to me that we're learning more about how these political dynamics played out between loyalists and patriots at that time. It's such a good informative lesson.
Yeah, no, and I think another project that I'm working on right now is we're going to be reinstalling our Battle of Bennington gallery this coming year. And the Joseph Rudd letter that I mentioned about him fighting against his neighbors and taking them prisoner, I've just been in the process of researching it, which is why when Joyce sent me this muster roll that indicated that 4 of Joseph Rudd's neighbors, because their names were on that muster roll that William Krieger's name was on as a person who died at the Battle of Bennington, the Snyders and Hallenbeck's names were on it as taken prisoner. So it just happened to be a happy coincidence that these two things were going on in my mind at the same time. So I was able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. But that's, as you say, we're working on the 250th right now in terms of exhibition projects here at the museum. And sometimes it's just sheer luck that those things come across your desk at the same time and you're able to connect the pieces. So I was really happy with that. And I'm looking forward to being able to chat with Joyce about it and using it as another kind of avenue for us to continue to dig deeper and see what else we can try and figure out about this story.
Remember, the 3rd annual Pownal Witches Walk is Saturday, September 13th at noon. Meet up at Dean Road Bridge.
Even if you're not in the Pownal, Vermont area, you can help memorialize Margaret Krieger by sharing her story and following the Pownal Historical Society on Facebook to stay connected with their events and research.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.